3 weeks. That is how long it's been since What About That TV Recap and Review published a new episode. During this time, I have personally gone through a gauntlet of emotions, and it's been difficult to find the energy to compose the podcast for what I'm about to say. So here it goes. Adair Gilliam has quit the podcast. She said she was leaving because it no longer brought her joy to do the podcast. She said the space she allotted for the cast was taking too much time out of her life and wanted to focus on other projects. Adair and I spend a lot of time in each other's scope. We created a podcast. We work together and have a friendship that's over 10 years in the making. It's not been without its ups and downs. And I am not going to act like I didn't play an enormous part in the failure of my own podcast, which is why on today's podcast, I'm going to do an autopsy, aka a Podtopsy. To quote the Hillary Hi Bic Clinton, what happened? Number 1, I didn't set the right expectations. I'm a natural producer. I have vision paired with a can-do attitude that can be difficult to keep up with. So, vision versus execution. Sometimes you have a strong vision of the things you would like to do, and the execution isn't there to match that vision. I think that this is an area where I struggled, and an area that Adair struggled to keep up with. Number 2, monetization. As a podcast producer, I didn't reach out to advertisers to get sponsorship or look for other ways to gain sponsorship. I set up a Patreon, but again, execution. One of the things we never set up in that Patreon was a soundbite to go with the write-up for the Patreon. So even if people saw it, there would be no way they could click and get a flavor of what the show might look like. And that's an area that I had no idea about when I started this endeavor. I knew that monetization was possible, but I didn't know where to start with it. I didn't know how to ask. I didn't know where to look to get it or gain it. And I just believed that we could have it. And so this is an area that I'm still struggling with, figuring out how to monetize a podcast. And it's 2 years in, and I feel like that growth has been really slow, and I'm still figuring it out. Number 3, initiative. If you want to be great, you have to work for it. It's not that I didn't work for it, but there were a lot of little things that didn't get checked. One little thing that grew into a larger thing is that we had outdated cover art. There was an error in our RSS feed that neither of us knew how to fix, and it was an eyesore for over a year where we just had terrible artwork from the very inception of our podcast. If you went onto the iTunes store and you found our podcast, you would see like a hand drawing What About That lady face, and there was no way I could figure out how to change it, and I had to reach out to a iTunes iMac genius person to help us, and that whole process was very frustrating, and finally we fixed it. But it was just one of those things that when you have a million things, you don't think about it, and it really affects the way you brand yourself. So our artwork was correct on the podcast app, the iTunes Store podcast app, but there was an error on the original iTunes Store. So on the app it looked okay, but in the store you could see the early art, and it was a hot mess express. And the last one, the biggest thing on my list, is respect. You cannot expect to be successful without this one thing. I feel our communication lacked this key element. It was the source of a lot of my frustration off the cast, and I was passive aggressive about making it known. I often compromised my sense of self-respect for the sake of just getting the work done, and that didn't make me happy. And in turn, I don't think it made Adair happy. And the language between us was just not cohesive. And that was something that started in our friendship and definitely carried over into the creative process. I would love, more than anything, to pass on some advice. Things to think about for people considering getting involved in podcasting, YouTubing, anyone who's ever wanted to be an influencer in a subgenre. Giant question most people should ask themselves before deciding to start a podcast should be whether or not to have a host or not. This definitely is something I'm pondering right now in life, so I've made a list of pros and cons. My question that I'm asking is whether you should, as a podcaster, as a YouTube host, choose to have a co-host or not. There are plenty of amazing things about having a co-host, and I want to bring that up right now. A co-host for your podcast or for your YouTube channel can bring a point of view which is different from your own. They provide a world view that you yourself wouldn't usually think of. A co-host can also provide dialogue. Without a co-host, there's just a lot of empty space. Without a co-host, you basically have a lectured, stylized monologue, and it's really hard to maintain a certain level of energy and factual information that people want to continue to listen to. Number 3, energy. Sometimes you don't have the energy for podcasting or have anything new to add to a conversation. So, like, it's a bad episode of Supergirl, and you don't even feel like talking about it. But you do a podcast about Supergirl, so you kind of have to talk about it. And the co-host provides energy, so, like, even if you don't always come prepared, or even if you weren't quite mentally in the zone, a co-host provides a bulk of discussion, and it can help to maintain the quality of your cast. Podcast presence, that's my number 4. Adair has wonderful podcast presence. She has a wonderful, clear, crisp podcasting voice. She's radio ready, whereas I struggle to talk most of the time. And from doing just this podcast, I discovered just how shit my enunciation really is. I sound like a Midwestern Bostonian beach girl who's like 16. Adair was one of those persons who was ready to always speak into a microphone and had a natural sense of presence, and that's just something I can't replace. A co-host can help with editing. That's my number 5. Sound design, sound engineering, creating interesting sound bites that make your podcast unique. Adair was great at all of those things. And lastly, social media. A co-host can help you with different aspects of social media. In this regard, Adair did a lot of reach out to the Winona Earp fandom to bring people to our podcast. And I really am very grateful. But just as there are great elements of having a co-host, there are some difficult things that go with working with people in general. Now I'm going to talk about what that entails. So if you are considering creating something, keep in mind these are the pros and cons. Consistency. When you have a co-host, you have to work with each other's schedules. Adair and I, we made a lot of calendars that we didn't always succeed in following through with. This was one of the things that frustrated both of us the most. Life would happen. We wouldn't be able to podcast on days we said we would. And because we were co-host, it would feel awkward, or it was a lot of heavy lifting to do towards doing a solo cast. Second, who owns the podcast? For instance, what do I pay Adair if I monetize the podcast at this very moment in life? We have 56 little tracks that we've put into the world, and half of it is hers and half of it is mine's. So you have to really think about this. When we started the podcast, we didn't have a written agreement as to what would happen should anything happen, should one of us leave the podcast. And now I find myself in a situation where I'm asking these very questions. Sound bites with my voice belong to me. Sound bites with her voice cost money because they are her creative property, and if I want to use them, I have to pay. What do I do about our Twitter account? That was a platform that both of us were working on building, and I know she really enjoyed it, but I think she wants to completely remove herself from the brand. So though I've told her she can use it, I don't think she will. So now it's my Twitter account, and that feels very odd. Do I relaunch the brand, or do I just start another podcast? That's another thing I've been asking myself. What will I do moving forward with this podcast? I think I already know, but this has been a heavy question on my mind. I have to just change all the descriptions on all of our platforms, and that's a lot. So, it's complicated. I'm not much of an editor. I can edit on a basic scale, but should I just outsource my editing to somebody else? And I know that I like to write the cast. That was my contribution, was that I was the writer, as a person who was coming up with ideas for segments like the wardrobe of the week, Twitterisms, top 5 list, quizzes, would you rather, just concepts like that. So editing is not my forte. I can edit. I'm going to edit this podcast, but it's just not something I do very quickly. So now I have to figure out if that's an outsourced thing or if that's something I'm just going to become better at. These are questions that I'm left thinking about during this time, and like I said, I don't have the immediate answers. Adair and I, we started this podcast together 2 years ago and have worked so hard to grow it into something that we're proud of. We share the same vision for how we wanted this cast to grow, and that vision still remains, at least it does for me. In the time that we have been co-creators, I really have come to appreciate this beautiful fan base and the community, and so although Adair is leaving, I have decided that I'm just going to continue to podcast. I believe in better media representation for minorities, women, LGBTQIA, allies. This is so important, and I want to continue to do what I can as an advocate and an influencer in this community. In regards to Adair's departure, I'm in no hurry to fill her voice or presence on this show with another co-host because frankly, I feel like it would be too soon. I hope for her the very best in her acting and singing career. She's someone who is truly wonderful to watch perform. If you ever catch her in a karaoke bar, ask her to sing Give Me One Reason by Tracy Chapman. The lady will blow your socks off. Moving forward, I will be doing a soft relaunch of the podcast. I will be introducing a guest star on the Salty Supergirl review to help me with this transition. I'm still debating on whether or not to change the logo. What do you think? Should I update it? Or should I leave it as is? These are more questions I have. My vision for the future is as ever ambitious. I want to publish every Tuesday the Salty Supergirl review. This is a challenge on my end to face the things I've struggled with. I want to be consistent. As a writer, I love other people's writing so much, I want to continue to produce podfic theater. This was one of the very last things Adair and I worked on prior to her leaving the show. But it was in working on this did I have a real realization how much I enjoy telling stories and providing a medium to do that. I want to build a safe space where people can listen to fanfic, and fanfic can be read out loud. Think like Audible, but for fanfic in your ears. I would love to do something like that, where each week we just highlight another fic, highlight another author, another contributor to this community, give praise where praise is deserved. I want to continue to fight against negative tropes and to be an advocate for media representation. I think that's my deepest seated soul desire. I want to attend Colexicon and nerd the fuck out with my fellow lady nerds. I want to become more technically savvy when it comes to editing and sound design. I want to continue to cover shows we love like Supergirl, Winona, Charmed, and add a few more shows to the queue like Vita, web series, comic books, video games. My biggest goal is to produce an original dramatic podfic series. Now this is why I was always kind of like the big dreamer in in the podcasting end of things between Adair and myself, I just had this vision of launching an original series, eventually getting to a point where we could produce an original series that would speak to this community. And I wrote a pilot that I thought was pretty good, and I recently pitched that pilot to Google Podcasts for a 20-week program producing it. If selected, this could be huge for me. Part of the application process, I had to create a budget for the show. And it was during this budgeting that everything began to feel very real for me. Started to feel like something that I could do, and I realized I wanted to do it more than anything. So I created another budget to see if I could shoot the pilot in a professional sound studio, and it's looking more and more doable every day. My show is called Artheria. It's non-binary King Arthur, a modern fantasy. What I really envisioned doing was having this podcast going, but then under my company name, Podcast Queens Production, producing a dramatic serialized series entitled Artheria. The format of the show is 25 to 20 minutes. It's 13 episodes long. It's dark comedy. The logline for the show is a young woman finds herself suddenly able to transform from female to male. Further complicating her life is the discovery that she is King Arthur of legend, brought into modern times by the sorceress Morgana. In her time, people only saw Artheria as the king they wanted to see. Thus, she presented male. Now given a second chance to live life in her true form, Artheria struggles to define what that might look like. Synopsis. Artheria is a sexual assault survivor working through her PTSD in therapy while at the same time working at Kingdom Quest dinner and tournament. By night, she is haunted by a wicked presence. During the day, she can barely make it to work on time. I have an unproduced sample of my Google Podcast submission for the show. I'm going to leave it at the end of the podcast for you all to hear, just to give you a taste of what I'm envisioning for my podcast theater, so you can enjoy that in lieu of not having content this week. So that's the dream. Those were the ideas that I had for the cast. It's very far away. It also feels very close. If you ever tuned in and found joy in this podcast, please reach out. I could really use the love from this community as I stare down the barrel of the daunting task of reinventing. Please reach out to me on Twitter, iTunes, YouTube. It would literally make my day. I've been so sad over all of this. None of this was where I saw myself going. But I believe that hardship teaches you growth, and there's growth in hardship. And I am someone who believes more than ever in producing quality podcasting content. So I will do my best to serve this community, to serve you, to try and be a consistent voice for you and a place where we can discuss things. And I just want you to know that I apologize for the 3 weeks that you haven't heard from us, and I look forward to everything that the future offers. And seriously, guys, my original dramatic series, Artheria, it's going to be a binge-worthy extravaganza finale. Envision this: professional voice actors, a badass heroine. It's Winona Earp in your ears. It is everything you would want in a series. Yes, Artheria is King Arthur, who's a lady who's also has the ability to turn into a man. It gets very confusing for her. She doesn't know what to do or how to define herself, but it also enables her to kind of walk in the steps of another's shoes as she figures herself out. And I just think this would be a great series for everyone, and I can't wait to share it and bring it to this community. And so stay tuned. I will be covering Elseworlds, all the worlds where Supergirl and Batwoman meet and collide in a hair off with hairography. Just kidding. yeah, so I'm going to try and cover that, and I'm going to also do a Salty Supergirl review, where I will be covering episodes 6 and 7. We really need to talk about the progression of Lena Luthor. Where is she going? Why is she wearing so much high-waisted pants these days? We need to talk about James Olsen. What are you doing, James? What is going on with you? We need to talk Charmed. I do not know what happened between Mel and her little girlfriend. I already miss them. I miss them. They miss me. We're gonna reunite. It's gonna be good. So thank you so much for staying tuned. Thank you so much for being a member of this community, and thank you so much for listening, because that's what we created this for. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you. Goodbye.
Podcast Queens Productions presents Artheria, written by Jennifer Montoya.
It's a homely office with cushy chairs, Tiffany lamps with shawls draped over them. There's a small table in the middle of the room with a bowl of ribbon candy from Christmas. Cheryl, my therapist, is Jewish. She thinks it's disarming, but...
Artheria, honey, 1 or 2 sugars.
2, please.
Have a candy.
No, thanks.
Have a candy.
Okay.
So, what did he say this time?
He was in my bed, whispering in my ear. He said, "I will have you. One way or another, you will be mine." Then I couldn't move, and he touched me.
That's new.
It dragged me to the end of the bed.
How many days of work did you miss?
4. Smoked my brains out.
Artheria. Okay, repeat after me.
I don't want to do this today.
Every day brings us a chance to start over.
No.
Come on, you got this.
Every day brings us a chance to start over.
Even devastation brings us closer to who we are.
I don't feel that way.
Not yet, but we'll get there. What's your goal this week?
Not to miss any more work.
Good. What else?
Getting a mani-pedi, even though the thought of getting one makes me want to vomit in my mouth.